Marcos was fortunate to be born into a very wealthy family that owned a food production company. When he became an adult, he took over the reins of the family business, significantly increasing its revenue. Despite this success, he could never truly enjoy his wealth. This story took place in Brazil in 2013, the largest and one of the most populous countries in Latin America. Home to over 200 million people, Brazil features wild tribes along the Amazon River who have never had contact with civilization. The Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro is not only a symbol of Brazil, but of the entire continent. This majestic 38-meter-tall statue is considered one of the new 7 wonders of the world. Brazil is known as the land of football, popular TV shows, the famous carnival, and has been a major source of coffee production for over 100 years. At that time, 48-year-old Marcos Matsunaga lived there with his 38-year-old wife, Alice. They had a 10-year age difference but seemed very happy together. They were also extremely wealthy. Marcos was a multimillionaire aspiring to become a billionaire. He owned a food company named Yuki, which produced items like popcorn and chips. This company had been passed down through several generations of his family. It was founded by his grandfather, Joshizo Kitano, in whose honor the successful company was named. Marcos later planned to sell the company for $1 billion, but he never achieved billionaire status. Before meeting Alice, Marcos had been married once and ended that relationship to dive into a whirlwind of passion and recklessness with his new love. However, it cannot be said for certain that Alice contributed to his previous marital issues. Marcos had a long history of cheating on his wife with various women, and Alice was just one of them, until he realized he had fallen in love. He met his new girlfriend online on an escort service website. Throughout his life, Marcos had never attracted much attention from women. He was overweight, had an inconspicuous appearance, and a difficult personality. However, he always sought validation of his importance, so he secretly hired escorts to satisfy his needs. That's where he met Alice, who later became his second wife. Alice came from a very dysfunctional family. They lived in extreme poverty, and as a child, she was often abused by her stepfather. This led to a very troubled childhood. Due to the unsafe area her family lived in, she constantly found herself in trouble. As Alice grew older, she managed to escape this dangerous place and trained to become a nurse. She had always been a caring, loving, and generous person, so when it came time to choose a profession, she decided to dedicate herself to helping sick people. However, all the warmth that had accumulated in her heart since childhood partially turned against her, leading her to be unable to continue caring for the sick. Alice realized that she became too attached to her patients, so much so that when their conditions worsened or when they died, she felt the loss as if they were her own family, causing her unimaginable pain. This job became a constant source of stress for Alice. She could not handle the emotional side of it and remembered how the death of one of her patients completely changed her worldview. Alice recognized that she could not withstand such psychological stress for long and could not continue working as a nurse. She had to choose a new career path and decided to study law. To support herself and finance her education, she began offering support services on the side. Initially, she enjoyed going out with men professionally, but only the intimate aspect related to the services made her nervous. It was in this way that she met the millionaire Marcos. The Matsunaga family was one of the richest families in Brazil at the time, and the food company Yuki was one of the leading companies in its field. A large part of this progress within the company occurred when Marcos took over the reins. He achieved much more than his father and grandfather had, expanding his business to a global level. Since childhood, Marcos was accustomed to having the best of everything, no matter how much money and success he had. The girls were almost uninterested in the guy. Some people thought he was not very attractive in the conventional sense, and possibly his personality traits had an influence. Nevertheless, even millions did not make him a suitable bachelor, and many attractive women with whom Marcos tried to establish relationships somehow disappeared very quickly from his life, and even money could not keep them. However, one day, when he was not yet the owner of the company, as it was managed by Marcos's father. A young woman appeared on the horizon. She was the first to show genuine interest in him, and the future millionaire got married. However, he did this not out of great love but out of desperation. When the man entered this marriage, he quickly realized that he was unhappy. Marcos was too hasty and made the wrong decision. Instead of getting a divorce and finding someone who really suited him, Matsunaga simply began cheating on his wife by hiring escort girls. Ultimately, Alice turned his head so much that he quickly filed for divorce and remarried. Of course, he had no intention of telling his family and friends that he had met the girl through an escort service and that he had paid her multiple times for intimate services. Marcos wanted to present this acquaintance as a natural meeting somewhere in a cafe and hoped that the truth would never come to light. The family asked no questions. In the end, they found out everything themselves. Alice was a pretty beautiful woman, and especially 10 years younger than Marcos. Most likely, she used her attractiveness and decided to marry a rich and not very attractive millionaire to get to his money. Friends tried to open Matsunaga's eyes to his girlfriend's motives, but he refused to believe that Alice had only selfish interests and tried to quickly put a ring on her finger as if he was afraid she would run away. Marcos hastily brought the woman into his huge villa full of luxurious things. Apart from Alice, Marcos was mainly obsessed with wine. He even built huge cellars under his house where he stored a selection of fine drinks worth a total of $2 million. Moreover, there was a secret room in the house, hidden in the wall and completely filled with weapons and ammunition worth $500,000. Matsunaga's house was full of excesses and some really eccentric things, but among them were also really expensive artworks. Marcos was excessively wasteful when buying certain things. The couple's life started very well. The newlyweds traveled everywhere, learned about other cultures together, and enjoyed good wine and food. Shortly after the wedding, the couple decided they wanted to have a child together, so Alice stopped taking the pill and looked forward to becoming pregnant. But it wasn't that simple. It turned out that Marcos's new wife was among the women who could not conceive a child in the usual way. No matter how much they tried, nothing worked. Fortunately, the Matsunaga family had enough money to undergo several medical procedures, and eventually, Alice became pregnant. 9 months later, she had a beautiful baby. The young parents were incredibly happy that their wish had come true, and the huge house was filled with baby items, infant food, and toys. After some time, even Marcus's friends admitted that they had been wrong when they considered Alice a gold digger. The couple continued to live together. They had a daughter in common and had a lot in common. Both enjoyed shooting and hunting animals. The couple would go into the woods and shoot wild boars, then skin them and slaughter the carcass. They also had a snake as a pet, which lived in a special terrarium. Marcos could not believe he had met a woman who wanted to go hunting with him and allowed him to have a snake at home. For the first time, a man was not only appreciated for his money, but also for his little quirks. The Matsunaga family was happy. At the end of May 2001, the millionaire food magnate Marcos Matsunaga disappeared. He vanished completely. All of this happened just as he was closing a $1 billion deal to sell the family business, Yoki. After his wife Alice reported him as missing, the police initially assumed it was probably a kidnapping. Everyone knew his family was among the wealthiest in all of Brazil, and that Marcos was closing this $1 billion deal. Surely there were many people who wanted to harm Matsunaga, or simply remove him from the way to prevent this big deal from being completed. The police began questioning all acquaintances and friends in Marcos's life. Did he have enemies or similar rivals, or could he wish that someone suddenly disappear? But no one could recall that Marcos had argued with anyone about business. Acquaintances could not name a single person who would be interested in the failure of this business deal. Everything seemed to be going well. The police spoke with the wife of the missing man. They wanted to get a picture of his daily routine, his schedule for the day of his disappearance, and the woman told the investigators that Marcos had told her the night he disappeared that he would meet one of the buyers who would pay $1 billion for Yuki. He warned that the deal could take a long time and asked her not to wait for him in the evening, but to go to bed. The next morning, he also had a very early appointment and warned his wife that he would most likely stay overnight at the office. When Alice woke up the next day, Marcos was still not at home. Since then, she had neither seen him nor heard anything from him. Therefore, the police were initially convinced of the ransom theory. They waited for the criminals to call with demands. Time passed. Everyone waited for news or calls regarding the ransom, but nothing came. No one demanded money or threatened to kill the millionaire. The investigators did everything they could to find Marcos himself, but there were no traces or clues as to which direction to look. A few days after the investigation began, Alice met at the house of Marcos's parents. She had something to tell them that she had not told the police. It turned out that Marcos had left her. He packed his bag and left voluntarily. He began cheating on her with other women. The pattern of marriage with the first wife repeated itself, and it was not the first time Alice had caught him. The man was humiliated and begged for forgiveness. The woman was pregnant with their daughter at this time and did not want the child to lose its father. Moreover, they had been waiting for the baby's birth for so long. At first, she was naturally very offended and so depressed by the grief that she wanted to leave him. But just at that moment, she found out about her pregnancy. This changed her attitude. However, it was clear that Marcos had not left this behind. In the first 2 years of his daughter's life, he behaved wonderfully, but a few months before his disappearance, he began cheating again. In May, Alice left town for about a week to visit her grandmother, who had become very ill. Even then, the woman began to think that her husband would take advantage of her absence. That's why Alice decided to hire a private detective to follow her husband while she was not around. Everything Marcos did was recorded and filmed. In the end, her premonition was not deceived. Every night that Alice was not at home, her husband cheated on her. It was again an escort named Natalia, whom he found on the same website as Alice. The husband met her, brought her home, and invited her to dine in the same restaurants he visited with his wife. It was seen by the owners and chefs who knew the Matsunaga family. It looked as if he was deliberately disregarding his wife. The private detective managed to gather evidence of Marcus's actions, and he handed everything over to Alice. It was a whole stack of diaries about where they went and what they did together, as well as video footage. Alice even showed her parents a video of Marcus with another woman before he disappeared. She presented him with this evidence and said she knew about the betrayal. Only this time, the man did not try to apologize and beg for forgiveness as he had done the first time. He simply packed his bag and left her. It turned out that no one had kidnapped him. He just walked away. Although the parents were devastated by the news of their son's infidelity, they sided with Alice because they felt sorry for the woman and her granddaughter. The Matsunaga family promised to ensure that mother and daughter would lack for nothing. The police were informed that no kidnapping had taken place, so it made no sense to expect ransom demands. A day or two after the investigators dropped their story, Marcos's brother received an email telling him that he was fine and not to worry. The man also asked Alice to tell him that he regretted his actions. That's all he said. He did not say where he was or what he was doing, just that he was safe and very sorry. The police confirmed that no real crime had occurred. Marcos simply ran away by cheating on his wife with another woman, and the investigation was closed. However, less than a week later, 30 kilometers from Marcos's house, something terrible was discovered. The dismembered body of a man was found. It was the body of Marcos Matsunaga, divided into several parts and scattered across fields and forests. Half of the parts were packed in ordinary blue garbage bags. The other body parts simply lay in the grass. Moreover, a blue bag was found containing his clothes, jeans, and a polo shirt. These were the items that helped identify the remains as Marcos Matsunaga, as all the clothes in this bag were designer clothes and accordingly very expensive. This entire outfit cost much more than most people in the area earned in a month. Lastly, the man's head was found. Dental records confirmed that this was the body of the missing millionaire. The cause of death was also announced. A single gunshot wound to the head took Marcos's life. When all the body parts were brought in for examination in the morgue, the medical examiner noted that all the cuts had been made very carefully and competently at the right places. It must have been done by someone who had a good understanding of human anatomy and biology. The criminal clearly knew where the main bones were and how he could more comfortably dismember the body. Therefore, he had certain medical knowledge. Aside from this assumption, however, they had no leads or suspects. They had no idea where to start their investigation. So the investigators decided to go to Marcos's house first, where he had recently lived with his wife and daughter, and take all the surveillance footage there. Since the last person who saw him alive was his wife, the police planned to track his movements from the starting point, see what he was wearing, how he looked that day, and whether he behaved strangely. They obtained the videos and began reviewing them, noting the footage where Matsunaga was recorded. The man was wearing the same clothes found next to the body, a shirt, and branded jeans. The first entry was made on May 19, 2001, exactly the day Alice returned from her trip. So she had not yet met with the private detective or seen incriminating recordings of her husband. Marcos picked her up from the airport and brought her and their daughter home. The woman was in no rush to cause a scandal and expose the cheating in the car, on the way home, or in the elevator. They appeared like an ordinary, loving family in the recordings. Later that evening, it is again seen on the recordings how Marcos goes downstairs to get a pizza. The man looked somewhat nervous and tired. After he picked up the pizza, he returned to the building, but never left the apartment again. However, the next morning, Alice Matsunaga was filmed by the camera, a woman coming out of their apartment with 3 very heavy suitcases, which she barely managed to carry into the elevator. Then she left the building, got into the car, and somehow loaded her luggage. A few hours later, she returned without the heavy load. What was in those suitcases and where did she take them? It was still unclear what happened in the apartment, but the police were convinced that Alice Matsunaga was somehow responsible for her own husband's death. She was the only adult in that apartment with him, and then he disappeared without leaving the house. Could she have killed him, then dismembered the body and taken it out in suitcases? There were many questions, which is why the officers almost immediately arrested Alice, although she tried to deny everything. But it was impossible to deny the recordings in one way or another. She was accused of a crime. After the investigators exhausted their questioning, she finally admitted to having taken her husband's life and told the police the sequence of events that led to this brutal crime. She said they had argued for several hours throughout the night. Then, late in the evening, they ordered pizza for takeaway because neither of them wanted to cook. Before the pizza was delivered, Marcos began to behave strangely. Someone called him, and he went to another room to talk on the phone. Then he returned to Alice and said that his father had called that evening and asked for help with something. After dinner, the husband got ready to go to his parents' house. Alice immediately realized this was a lie. She knew her husband intended to leave her that first night to return to his mistress. From the messages of the private detective, the woman knew that Marcos and Natalia had met every evening of the past week, and even after 7 days of separation, he was ready to leave her alone in the apartment for a date. Naturally, Alice was furious. Her original plan was to stay calm and try to discuss the situation quietly and solve the problem in a more balanced way. However, when she heard that her husband was supposedly going to visit his father, her patience burst like a soap bubble. She could no longer hold back and began to scream at him. Again, Marcos did not try to ask for her forgiveness or make up for his guilt towards her in any way. On the contrary, he became terribly angry and said she was crazy and had made everything up. He hurled hurtful words at her, saying Alice was paranoid, an insecure and unstable woman. The most hurtful thing was that he said she was an inappropriate mother for their daughter. For her, this was nothing new, as Marcos had often hinted at this during their relationship. However, it exceeded her strength to listen to unpleasant things about herself when she caught her husband cheating. Outwardly, the relationship in the Matsunaga family seemed very happy, but inside it was quite abusive. Marcos had always been very possessive and did not allow his wife to have male friends. Whenever she went to law school, he called her about every half hour to find out where she was and whether there were men nearby. She even had to ask her male classmates not to talk in the background while she was on the phone with her husband. Throughout their entire family life, Marcos humiliated Alice and made her feel worthless and inferior. He constantly reminded her of her work in the escort service, saying that he had pulled her out of the dirt, after which he usually sarcastically wished her luck finding another man who would appreciate her past work. At the same time, he referred to it as something suitable only for providing intimate services. The woman desperately wanted to change her life by contacting Marcos one day, but the man was not okay with that. That night, Marcos repeated those cruel words, and then at some point during this confrontation, he hit his wife in the face, which was the first time he had hit her. Before, their arguments had never gone beyond verbal insults. But for Alice, this slap in the face was a turning point. Now she knew what her husband was capable of, and she was not willing to tolerate his escapades. The woman immediately decided to divorce, which she informed her husband about. In response, Marcos calmly said that she could leave him, but she could not take their daughter with her. He promised to ensure that she would not get custody of the child. He threatened to tell everyone that Alice was not capable of taking care of the baby, and that she would be put in a psychiatric clinic if she tried to take her daughter away. According to Alice, throughout their entire family life, Marcos threatened and manipulated her. She could not remember the details of that night. It was an emotional blur. Here, she had a weapon in her hand, and her husband was coming right at her, urging her, "Shoot me!" She pointed the gun at Marcos and pulled the trigger without realizing it. One shot was enough to make the man fall dead. There was no turning back now. Panic began. Alice felt the weight of her actions. She knew she would spend the rest of her life in prison. And she also knew that her daughter would now have not only no father, but also no mother. For her child's sake, she tried to hide the crime. Alice knew no other way to get rid of the body than to dismember it and take it out of the house. She grabbed the hunting knives with which Marcos and she usually dismembered wild boar carcasses. It was clear that she was good with cold steel, and it turned out that it was Marcos who had taught her how to skin animals and cut bones, and he had bought her the gun that became the murder weapon. Alice Matsunaga spent the next 2 weeks pretending to be a grieving wife, but in reality, she was afraid that not the whole truth about her deed would come to light. Her humanity was instantly blocked by a terrible image of how a woman spent several hours there and cut her husband's body into pieces. Many people believe that Alice made up all these harassments and insults because Marcos could not refute them now. This case is very controversial. After reviewing all the evidence, the prosecution concluded that, judging by the trajectory of the bullet, the man was either sitting or lying down, meaning that Alice had indeed planned in advance to get rid of her annoying millionaire husband. It is also worth considering that their daughter was in the next room during the act. The autopsy also showed that Marcos had blood in his lungs, meaning that the man was still alive when Alice dismembered him. The woman pretended not to understand how Marcos could still be alive after a gunshot wound to the head. Ultimately, Alice Matsunaga was found guilty of her husband's death and cover-up. She was sentenced to 19 years and 11 months in prison and is scheduled to be released in 2025. Currently, the child is being raised by Marcos's parents and the girl is doing well.